So here is some chit-chat following a US House Intelligence Committee. Some of the people there got a bit worried, and we're now learning some news that Russia apparently is putting nuclear weapons into space. Is this American posturing? Are there political motives? What's going on?
It's an odd story, isn't it? Because, this committee, they came out from what's described as at least a secret, probably top secret briefing that they can't talk about. They were so worried about what they heard that they said that there were some serious national security concerns and that President Biden needed to declassify some of this program. And you went, what program? It turns out they were had been briefed on the potential for Russia to put nuclear weapons in space to threaten the US satellite constellation, and therefore, satellites provide so much that we rely on these days that it would be a serious vulnerability if they were to do that. It's also the fact that the Russians are signatories to the Outer Space Treaty, which sounds a bit Star Warsy, doesn't it? But it was signed in 1967, and it bans any form of orbital nuclear weapons. And it's also, of course, it's all linked to this weaponization of space. Everybody's massively concerned.
And as we know, Putin's very good with those sort of agreements, isn't he?
Well, we've seen over the last few years, haven't we? He tends to tear them up. I think what's fascinating to get behind this, because I initially, when I heard the story, went, putting nuclear weapons on the top of rockets. We've just recently had a couple of rocket launches into space that have failed, and where would that leave us if nuclear weapons go off? Why wouldn't Russia want to put nuclear weapon in space? Because there's other ways of. From my time in the military, I was aware that one of the biggest threats was not exploding a nuclear weapon in space, but because actually it has a lot of serious implications. Do you know the last time I think that a country put a weapon into space and exploded it?
A nuclear weapon?
Nuclear weapon.
No.
Yeah, so it was back in the 1960s. It was a program called Starfish Prime, which the US, I think it was 3 or 4 nuclear weapons they put into space to see the effects it would have back in the 1960s, the year I was born, in fact. But there were unintended consequences of that. They didn't fully understand what was going to happen. And it turned out that at the time, 1960s, there weren't many satellites in orbit. The Brits lost 3 satellites to that explosion, so it had all sorts of consequences,
and the debris after it as well.
Well, exactly. So it's a really indiscriminate weapon, and Russia is also very heavily dependent on satellites. And actually, a much easier way of taking out the satellite constellation is literally to launch a load of sand into space, explode sand in low Earth orbit, and there's no risk if the rocket blows up on launch. But little particles of sand travelling at tens of thousands of miles an hour will destroy satellites. So that would be a much safer...
Everybody's satellites.
Everybody's satellites. So if that's what you wanted to do, why would you put a nuclear weapon? And actually what's interesting, I think, to try and get behind this story...
So is this actually Russia doing this, or is there something else going on in the
I
US?
think there's something else going on. And part of that is... I'm old enough, and you are certainly old enough to remember the.
Thank you.
Yes, my pleasure.
Well, I've just learned a couple of things today. Well, obviously the Russian weapons into space. Also, you're a lot younger than I thought you were, Sean.
It's not the years, it's the mileage. Just remember that. But no, going back to the topic, back in '83, Reagan. You might remember the Star Wars Initiative.
I actually do.
Yeah, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, and at the time, America was experimenting with lasers in space to take out missiles and enemy satellites. And then it all went quiet. 40 years ago that happened. Do you think that the Americas stopped developing any capability at that time?
No.
I don't think so
Under
either.
the cover,
But it will be covert programs that are secret, top secret, or well above. How do you get funding for programs like that when they are top secret?
Scare the EBGBs out of everybody.
Yeah. By creating a potential threat, I'm not saying it's not a real one, but creating a potential threat, senators get all excited, and now you attract funding. And we're on the eve of a presidential election. It's all about spending priorities. And I think what's fascinating, if you look at, again, I remember the first moon landings, all black and white, because it was 50 odd years ago, wasn't it? Actually, since the 60s, there's been very little, US pioneered the space travel, and since about 63, 64, largely went a bit quiet. And if you look at who's landed on the moon in the last few years, it's not just America, it's all sorts of other nations. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if actually this is part of the political figures in the US going, we've taken our eye off the ball here. Are we prepared to let ourselves slip back in terms of our role in space?
Well, you've only got to say the word nuclear and everybody gets excited. So it's a good way to turn the heat up. So maybe we're going to be looking to you, as with some other topics, to keep us up to date, Sean.
Well, but I think this is a really interesting one, because even Putin turned around and said this is a shameless effort to attract more funding for a program. Now, you can never trust what Putin is saying or whatever, but really putting a nuclear weapon on the top of a big missile and orbit that in space, I just don't see how that makes sense. And it's very difficult to see how it does. There has to be something more to it. And I think it'll be interesting for our viewers just to work out what do they think is going on here. What have the Americans got in space? What sort of capability is there? And how do you continue to develop it?